I have my hot chocolate ready to go.
Oh, it's a hot chocolate.
Yeah, it's from the. Oh, we're live.
Okay, cool.
Here we go.
Alrighty. So, hello. Yeah, we're live. Okay, perfect. So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming tonight to our Black Speaker Series today. We have Anthony Morgan with us tonight to be able to give us an amazing talk. But first, I'd just like to start off by giving the Territorial land acknowledgement. So, we would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on Indigenous lands. The Jotjage Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and waters of which we gather on today. The Ganekahaga Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So, good evening, everyone. I'm going to just begin by giving an introduction to Anthony Morgan. So, Anthony Morgan is the manager of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism, the CABR unit. The CABR is responsible for the implementation of the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism. Additionally, Anthony maintains a separate practice of providing various services, including human rights education, legal research, analysis, and drafting support. Throughout his work, Anthony is able to build on more than a decade of developing and expertise in leveraging human rights law to address expressions of anti-Black racism. So thank you for being able to talk to us, Anthony.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. So we kind of just wanted, to just gauge about the work that you do in the city of Toronto for fighting anti-Black racism. If you could touch upon that for us.
Sure. So in December 2017, City Council in the City of Toronto agreed to adopt the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism. Now, the action plan came out of a very specific moment of organizing and resistance in Black communities that was led by Black Lives Matter Toronto in March 2016. And so some of you may know or may have heard or done your own research and learned about the ways in which the City of Toronto was really grappling with the movement of Black Lives Matter around that time, because in March 2016, Black Lives Matter Toronto led a protest out front of Toronto Police Headquarters for 2 weeks out in the front area of that space. And then hundreds of different allies and supporters came out to hold that space and developed it into what some refer to as a tent city or a Black city, names that it went by. And so because that was a protest unlike many city leaders had seen in quite some time, it made them stop and say, okay, we need to take a moment and try to figure out what's really happening here. And so the city decided to reach out to Black leaders from across the city and have a conversation and be responsive to what Black Lives Matter was organizing and advocating for. And what they were essentially arguing for is for more police accountability, but also just a more well-being, more equity, more justice for Black communities writ large in the areas of employment, education, housing, healthcare. Just generally, it was a recognition of the fact that the city was failing Black folks. And so with the city's response, initially they were looking to do a research report, or that was the suggestion. But Black communities came out and said, absolutely not, because we already know the data and statistics of marginalization for Black people, and that will only delay action. What we need is immediate action. And so that led to a process where the city engaged different subject matter experts from Black communities and engaged multiple Black serving organizations, and ultimately the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism was born. And so that action plan was adopted, as I mentioned, in December 2017. And with it, there was a permanent unit of the city that I now have the opportunity to lead. I'm not the founding manager of the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit. The founding manager is Ainania Eodele Grant, after the work that she did for almost 2 years laying the groundwork and the foundation for the unit, she ultimately ended up being promoted to director, a director within the city of Toronto. So she is actually still my boss. I joined the team as a community development officer, and now I have the opportunity to lead the team. And so what my work looks like is working with my team. We're a team of 5 and 2 interns. And what we focus on is looking at the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism and partnering with city divisions, community organizations, and different stakeholders towards the implementation of the action plan, which covers 5 areas of life: job opportunities and income supports, policing and the justice system, Black leadership and community engagement, health and community services, and child and youth development. So on the day-to-day, our team is looking at ways to better the well-being of Black communities through the action plan.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. I guess with that, how are you right now experiencing, I guess, with what's going on right now with the whole Black Lives Matter movement? And I guess, how do you feel that's impacted your work so far with the work that you're doing right now?
So it certainly created an added layer of urgency for our work. We've always handled our work with a certain a certain kind of urgency, knowing the histories and experiences of Black communities. And so with the upsurge of what I refer to generally as, and some others have referred to as sort of the second wave of Black Lives Matter, it's increased the attention, the focus, and the interest in this kind of work when it comes to major institutions addressing anti-Black racism seriously. Many institutions don't have the kind of infrastructure that the city of Toronto has developed, and in a kind of way, the city has a head start. And so that's led to many different folks reaching out to us to get an understanding as to, in the corporate world, other levels of government, community organizations, just trying to get a handle on how they can make statements about Black Lives Matter real in terms of implementation. And so we've been reached out to for that. But actually, I think the greater pressure comes from the increased needs that Black communities are facing, because we know that before COVID-19 hit, Black communities were experiencing elevated rates of food insecurity, joblessness, being unemployed and underemployed, housing precarity, inaccessible healthcare services, and of course, disparities as it relates to policing and the justice system, high rates of contact, police use of lethal force, and general forms of injustice. And so within this context, the pressures on Black communities have unfortunately increased. And so we as a team have had to be very nimble, creative, and dynamic in shifting some of the work that we're doing to make sure that we're reaching those needs. And we're a very small team comparatively. The city of Toronto has some 33,000 plus staff generally, and we're the team tasked with supporting our divisions across the city. But when it comes to the Black population in the city of Toronto, it's some 440,000 plus. And so while not all of our community members are experiencing socioeconomic hardship, we know that Black communities experience socioeconomic hardship at disproportionately high rates, and COVID has only exacerbated that, with Black communities in the city of Toronto actually being the racial group that has the highest rate of infection within the city, and not because they're Black, but because they live in the most precarious positions and or precarious conditions, with crowding within housing, but also doing work that like personal support workers are doing, other kind of frontline service work that puts them at increased risk. And that's been a challenge for us to be responsive to.
So yeah, you clearly, like, you have a lot of experience working in activism for BLM or just injustice. But I want to take you back a little bit more, back to university. Like, what exactly were there things that you did in university that allowed you to be in a position that you are in now? And what recommendations do you have for students that are listening?
Yeah, so what feels like eons ago, when I was a law student at McGill Law, I just happened to be on campus, and there were some students who were parading in blackface makeup and doing chants and cheers um, associated with marijuana and monkeys, and it was by and large one of the most unusual experiences that I had. I ended up recording that and also sharing it with media, and it led to somewhat of a media storm at the time. This is 2011, I believe. And so part of what came out of that was I ended up doing an interview with a range of media, but one of them being with CNN. And so it created a space for me where I was realizing the level of conversation that needed to happen around anti-Black racism within our country hadn't yet reached levels that would translate into change, and it made me want to participate in that. And so that certainly wasn't planned. That was something I happened upon, but it's an experience that really shaped me when I was a student. Now, for most folks, of course, you're not going to necessarily run upon a situation like that, and I'm not in any way wanting to be heard as suggesting that you should search for things like that to record, to go viral, and then end up doing a number of interviews on that. But why I point to it is that I like the rest of you in the course of the work that you'll do, there's things that you'll see and you'll have to make a choice. Do I speak up? Don't I speak up? Do I say something about this? And don't I say something about this? And also, if I am going to say something about it, how do I need to be prepared for, frankly, some of the backlash? Because when I did speak up, naturally there was some backlash because of sometimes misunderstandings or just frustration, anger, or resistance to people naming anti-Black racism, or people being defensive, thinking that they're being called racist, and seeing that as being more offensive than actually engaging in racist behavior. So for me, I think part of what allowed me to be effective in that context was, one, the relationships that I had. So as students, I think it's really important to think about the relationships and the connections that you have and you build, because there were moments where I felt exceptionally vulnerable. While public advocacy can be very cool and look very exciting at different times, and I'm not going to lie, there's points when, especially when the issues that you're advocating for, you start to see some progress that feels really good. But there's also a lot of exposure where a lot of people have access to you, and you start getting hate mail, you start getting veiled or direct threats. It doesn't feel good. And I don't say that to scare folks, but I don't think I would be responsible if I were to talk about the kind of advocacy that I've taken up without noting that that's kind of part of it. But if you have healthy, strong relationships, you create communities around yourself, whether it be your classmates, folks within community, your family, you have that space around you, your professors who you go to for that support can help you weather some of those things, but also guide you. So I'm sure there are people who are listening to this and you're saying, I'm not that kind of frontline activist person, which is totally okay. There are other spaces and other ways to process these things. And I remember, although this incident of blackface happened on the campus of University of Montreal, I wasn't a student there, I'm a McGill student. I did go back to my faculty and I did have some really good conversations with some of my professors and my dean. And I literally asked, like, the cat was kind of out of the bag, but I was like, is this okay? I hope I'm not misstepping or like making too much of this. And they were really supportive. And they said, yeah, we understand the controversy and we understand the pushback, but no, we believe that this is in line with what we should be doing for a more just and fair society, calling things out and speaking honestly and openly to it, and also finding solutions for change. And so what I would encourage folks to do is, again, there are issues and causes that you'll care about, that you'll be thinking about. It could be racial justice issues, Black Lives Matter as a movement, or it could be intersecting with other struggles of advocacy and resistance. And I would say, no matter what it is that's pushing you into a space of advocacy or organizing, that doesn't have to be and often isn't front facing, it's really important that you find ways to build community for that. It helps sharpen you. It's a space that can hold you. And also, because we're all human, we'll make mistakes. If you're stepping out of line, if you're mischaracterizing things, or if you're making wrong movements or building relationships with folks in spaces that are not necessarily in line or in keeping with what the movement should be doing, that your community around you will help pull you in and say, hey, like, let's look at this again. and there's all kinds of ways to build community. And when you're a student, it's actually much easier. I can say this now that I've been out of the world of being a student for some time. Don't take for granted the proximity that you have. And yes, with COVID, you don't have the same kind of physical proximity, but you're in communication and connection in a different kind of way. So I would encourage folks to continue to cultivate that, because you don't know where it'll take you. My daughter behind me agrees.
You kind of like brought this up, and it's something that I'm a little like wanted to know more about. Like when you spoke about advocating for things like Black Lives Matter, sometimes I think there are problems with knowing your rights, and I realized that as like a student, sometimes I'd want to advocate or protest, especially while we had it in Montreal, and sometimes we can see that there's sometimes like police like kind of using the law in their favor, and then we don't really know how to react to that. And I was hoping that maybe you can kind of give your input, also considering that you're a lawyer, and maybe it could help also other Concordia students that are watching.
Sure. So what I would say from the outset is that although I'm a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer in Quebec, and so laws, especially around policing, are provincially grounded and guided. And so nothing I'm saying, this is just the proviso, should be understood as legal advice, but things to just keep in mind of. So generally, yes, within the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have the right to assemble, we have the right to protest, we have free speech. That said, in this context, we recognize that there's a considerable amount of police repression that happens, especially when you're advocating around issues of racial justice. And we know that this is part of the histories and experiences of racism, but you should know that if you are assembling to express political opinion and you're not harming anybody, you're just articulating yourself, you have the right to be there. You can carry your sign, you can function in that space. There are all kinds of ways in which police often move, especially around these protest movements, where you will become uncertain about whether or not you are actually moving within the law. But by and large, know that at first principles, you do have that right, and you can articulate yourself. And the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does give you that protection. Always be mindful of your surroundings when you're operating that space, and listen carefully when officers are even though they're barking commands, and it's will not be received as de-escalation, and it often is not. Sometimes it's the case law shows it's provocation of one sort or another. But I think one thing that you definitely want to be mindful of is, while you might show up alone, try not to stay alone, because that could put you in a tight position. Just because by virtue of just the one person's word versus another, you don't want to be in a situation where it's your word versus an officer's alone. Having other people around is important. There's also the issue of whether or not you can record. As long as you're not obstructing the officers in the conduct of their work, generally speaking, you're allowed to record what's happening. We know that there's a gap. We have to acknowledge there's a gap between what your rights are and how they operate, but you should know that you have those rights. But at the same time, there's a level of prudence and reality that we have to take these situations with. And so, again, moving in spaces with other folks, having a sense of what your rights are. And there almost always, especially within Black Lives Matter protests, there are legal observers that are often trained to serve the function of making sure that folks' rights are respected. In Ontario, at least, I'm quite confident that it might be similar. They usually have very visible hats, so neon yellow or neon orange hats, so you can identify them. So if you see somebody who is wearing one of those hats, they will be otherwise dressed quite normally, but it's that hat that usually they use to be identified. And you might ask, are you a legal observer? And if they don't present themselves immediately as such, do keep your eye on where they are. You don't want to be too far from where a legal observer is, because they also can play an instrumental role. If things gets uncomfortable and the officers start to move in and start to arrest or just become more aggressive, being close to a legal observer can often help where possible. I know that's not always possible, but it's something to be mindful of. And again, I recognize that that's very general, but I think I would be irresponsible if I said like specifically in this scenario you can or you cannot do, because there are all kinds of complications or specifics that could come up that could that would change the dynamic. But generally, know that you have the right, but also protect yourselves. Be realistic about the scenario, and if you know a police service has a penchant for being unnecessarily violent, be mindful. I'm not saying don't show up. I think part of what has allowed change to happen on so many issues is folks still showing up, but show up in a way that's fully conscious of the reality. Protect yourself by going with other people. Again, stay conscious and present around legal observers, and and always know that you also have a right to say that, no, I've walked this far with the protest, I'm going to step out. You don't always feel compelled to need to articulate your resistance in that way. It's a powerful and important way, but there are also a range of different ways. It could be writing, it could be different kinds of organizing, it can be support in a range of capacities. So don't ever feel like if you're not on the streets with folks that you're not really committed. That's one way of demonstrating your commitment. But as you grow, as you learn, you'll see that there's so many other ways that are also very powerful and important.
Yeah. As you may or may not know, we our annual campaign this year at the CSU is the Black Lives Matter campaign. Mm-hmm. And you were mentioning that, obviously, like in Ontario, laws are different than Quebec laws, but I believe that the BLM campaign in Canada is it's asking it's uniform in its requests. So from a lawyer standpoint, what's like, how do you view those requests? Do you think they're reasonable?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I haven't reviewed the specifics of the articulations from Black Lives Matter chapters across Canada. That said, ultimately what we know is we need deeper police accountability for sure. And we need to depolice. We need to detask and depolice. If we look at what's been happening over the last number of decades since the war on drugs, there's been an alarming explosion of police budgets. At the same time, there's been an implosion as it relates to providing funding for social support. So again, supports for housing, education, employment, healthcare, childcare, transit, all these areas of social well-being and social life have suffered considerable declines in their public support, while police budgets have grown in some instances exponentially. And so while I can't speak to the specifics of the request, insofar as they're in alignment with changing that trajectory, 100% that's more than reasonable. It's prudent and it's overdue. And I think that's why tens of thousands, if not millions, of folks are coming out and saying, yeah, this is a serious movement. It's about serious change. Because at the end of the day, we would all benefit from better resource socioeconomic supports for our communities. Because when it comes to any kind of social disadvantage, we recognize that the main, it's often the main cause of community discord or dysfunction or harm or trauma that communities are facing when they are neglected or they have resources stripped from them. And so we all benefit from heeding to the cause of Black Lives Matter insofar as they're consistent with that.
Right. Just a quick follow-up on that. In Montreal, there's a few groups that are activists for racial equality, and they're all fighting for similar goals, but they're approaching it in different ways. And we had kind of talked about this earlier. What is it that we could do to, like, we obviously have different ways. We all think of different ways of approaching a problem, but we don't want to be like fighting each other on the same goal. What are some ways we could do to come together in that sense, right? I think you started not an organization, but you're leading a task force.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Right. Right now you're
I'm the manager of the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit.
Right. Right, and there are other people, I guess, like doing similar work, but not in that same group. So
Yeah, so sorry, I misunderstood the initial question, but I know where you're going with it now. So yeah, there's a range of ways you can address anti-Black racism, and folks won't always agree on the method. They might say that, yeah, we all want to address anti-Black racism, but how you're doing it is not. We don't believe in it. I think that's okay, and that's actually quite healthy when you have a diverse range of perspectives and ideas. I think it's more just being honest and open and critical about where you stand, and being sure enough about yourself to say, okay, these are the areas that I believe in, or this is the position that I take on a particular thing. Hearing other folks on where they stand and how they want to move, and then trying to find, as John Rawls calls it, the overlapping consensus. I don't think he's the overlapping consensus is language that he's known to have coined, but it's a concept that is as old as, I would say, civilization, where you have people walking from different areas of life and say, okay, there are these common things that we can pull from, even around methods. And in those spaces of commonality, we will build while also respecting our differences. And so I think being an active, ongoing conversation about that, and doing your best to be alive to the ways in which the structures of capitalism, patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, they will always try to put us in competition. It actually serves systems of oppression to tear each other down, because while we're tearing each other down, these systems end up being able to thrive. And so we have to resist that impulse to say that you're doing it differently, and so therefore you're doing it wrong, and I'm going to come for you. I'm going to trash you. I'm going to trash the folks that are a part of your organization because you're just misguided. That is, again, that's just a bonnet in the hat of systems of oppression, in the sense it just benefits them. And while they might not smile in our face, we know that in closed doors, they like to see that. And there's a part of it that ends up being, it's just in their interest to do, and sometimes they foment it. They will literally find ways to put different folks who seem to be moving in the same direction or calling for change around Black lives, but then put folks in competition, and they tear each other down, and then ultimately the system gets to move forward. So a way to resist that, I would say, is, again, finding ways to build commonality and consensus. You won't always find it. I don't want to be unrealistic, but at least being open to it, and try to be generative in your difference. So when I say be generative, and I'm thinking about the work of Adrienne Marie Brown in her book. It's phenomenal text if you're interested in organizing and advocacy, emergent strategy, and thinking about the ways in which you can still come together, and that conflict, that tension can be used. The energy of that can be used in a positive way if you can stay committed to moving in that direction, as opposed to being destructive and tearing things down.
I have my mute button on, the typical Zoom Zoom action. But speaking on that note, also, I wanted to touch upon a bit about the institutional racism that we have in Canada, and very much so among Black people, and very much among Indigenous people. I'm not sure if you were familiar with the incident that happened with Joyce Echequan in Joliet, Quebec, where she heard these racial slurs in the hospital while being treated before she unfortunately passed away. And so, we see these multiple layers that are going on within Canada, and we think that Canada is a very, we're not like the States. We don't do these certain things, and we don't really, in that sense, want to acknowledge, the stuff that we have put into place, which disadvantages a lot of minority groups. So how, do you think, as people who are thinking about going into advocacy, how is that something we can try and combat, trying to dig through these layers that we have in Canada that aren't really as much brought to light and discussed, or just put on the back burner?
Yeah, I do think there has to be a moment of recognizing that, by and large, we've actually been lied to, and the lie is actually a big part of the national project to allow systems of oppression to project themselves. So, and certainly Canada, it's not unique to Canada, but the ways in which it manifests are particular to Canada. And so the stories that we've been told about who Indigenous people are, who owns this land, we're starting to make those shifts of course, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action, the 94 calls to action, which is helping us collectively redirect our understandings as to what this space is in terms of what it's meant in the context of colonization, but also other forms of and deep systems of oppression and marginalization and outright violence. And so what we have to do is first become very critical about what we're being taught and what we've been told about people who are experiencing disadvantage, especially Indigenous communities, and then rethink the stories. There's so many resources out there. Admittedly, they're not all good, but as in, like, it's the internet, and so you can get some trash information out there, but try to find some credible sources. And if you do put in that effort, that consistent effort, you'll start to see where there are credible sources of information to help us rethink the space, and not just rethink it for its own sake, but to help us spur towards action to resist injustice. So it's not that there's something fundamentally wrong or broken with Indigenous people or Black people or any other community that's experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. They've been put in conditions over several centuries in some instances, and what we are seeing is a manifestation of that legacy. And so to be able to, I think, meaningfully address some of those challenges, you have to take into consideration that history, those histories that Black folks have experienced, that Indigenous folks have experienced. And there's an interesting point of intersection there that we don't talk about enough within Canada. So the first recorded person of African descent actually shows up in Quebec, Olivier Lejeune, in 1628. And you have to think about what it meant to have enslaved Black people on the lands of Quebec and on the lands of what became Canada, and what that meant also for Indigenous people. Part of the challenging history there is that while Indigenous and Black people were enslaved, there's also a history of Indigenous people owning Black people as slaves. And so I think if we're really committed to organizing a resistance, we have to create spaces for us to have those conversations in supportive and generative ways and say, okay, this is the reality, but look at our ongoing struggles, look at the things that we have in common, and build from there. But a figure I like to turn to that really helps point to the importance of a kind of solidarity when it comes to Indigenous resistance and organizing and advocating for Black lives is, I think about the personage of Matthew DaCosta, who's the first recorded person of African descent on Canadian lands. So why I think he's important is because he was a free person, Black man, absolutely in the record noted as such. He was born in Portugal. He spoke Portuguese. He was an interpreter of not just several European languages, but also several Indigenous languages. And he was hired by the French settlers that initially colonially settled these lands. But he was called on because he had these relationships, he had that knowledge, he had the language, he knew what Indigenous communities were trading in, he knew where they were, he knew how to communicate with them, and that's why he was hired by the French to do what he did. Now, of course, that led to colossal results in terms of facilitating those relationships. But what I like to think about, in the absence of the actual rooted record, is, well, what did his relationship look like with Indigenous communities that he was able to get proximate enough to learn the languages, to learn what they were trading? There had to have been a level of trust, understanding, some kind of mutuality where you have this Black man and these Indigenous folks connecting on a level that ended up being manipulated and used for like awful reasons we see and what happened afterwards. But for him to develop that skills, those relationships, I think that says something about a history that we need to pull on, a legacy of a tradition of mutuality and seeing each other between Black and Indigenous folks that I think we can build from. Admittedly, I'm not drawing from an actual historical text and a record to say this is what it looked like, but I think resistance calls for us to fill in and use our imaginations where we can in a way that will help advance struggles, because of course, please believe these systems of oppression do that all the time. They re-envision their histories to make themselves heroes, and I think we can do it in a constructive way to organize and build resistance for change. And so I encourage folks to think more about Matthew DaCosta, the years before he shows up in the historical record in 1604. How did he learn Indigenous languages? Who was he around? How did he learn what they were trading, where they would be? And try to, I think, build from that space when it comes to solidarity between Black and Indigenous spaces.
Thanks.
I actually had a question that kind of ties in Indigenous people as well as Black people. Essentially, after the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of people started researching more on institutional racism that Black people face. And then, as Sarah mentioned, there was also Indigenous people, like especially in Quebec, where a lot of media attention started going to them because of the hospital incident, for example. So essentially, the Black Lives Matter movement started to grow a lot more, especially after the murder of George Floyd. But on the other side of the coin, there was also another movement that kind of started, and I'm not sure if it started, from my understanding, I feel like it started now. Maybe it was present beforehand, and you can like explain more about it. But maybe you might have heard of the All Lives Matter movement. And I kind of wanted to know more your point of view and your experience on that. And yeah.
Sure. So All Lives Matter it's, I don't know, I hesitate to call it a movement. I'm biased, admittedly, of course, because of where I stand on the statement and the movement of Black Lives, movement for Black Lives. But ultimately, when we're thinking about folks' call, when they say All Lives Matter, overwhelmingly, it is used in a space to silence, delegitimize, or marginalize the claims of Black Lives Matter, because folks are feeling threatened that by focusing on Black people and the well-being of Black folks, then somehow it'll mean less for somebody else, people who are not Black, or they hear within Black Lives Matter a call towards exclusion as opposed to a call towards inclusion, which I think says more about the individuals and the groups than it does about the movement for Black lives. And so I think it should be understood that discursively, it is a response that's meant to maintain the status quo. Overwhelmingly, I wouldn't say always, but often when you look at where the All Lives Matter claim comes up, it doesn't start as a first principle. It's always a response to. So where did this movement come from before? We didn't hear anybody talking about All Lives Matter until Black people started using that phrase as a grounding for resistance. And also there's, of course, logically embedded within it, if all lives really mattered, then we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. And that's the exact point. And so in another way, it also suggests that deep within the consciousness of the movement is a lack of regard for the humanity, well-being, and lives for Black people. And so we should be very suspicious and cautious of the conscious and unconscious ways in which people who use the phrase are just reifying or supporting a kind of violence against Black people, even if it's just psychic violence that can translate into just a kind of apathy towards the degree of pain, marginalization, suffering that Black communities have experienced, and they are organizing with allies, with supporters, and different institutions to address. And so, yeah, I hope that's useful in terms of my reflections on it.
I actually had like an additional question on that.
Sure.
How would you kind of, if you met a person that believed in that movement, how would you kind of come across and explain, kind of just to have them understand more the things that Black people or minorities also go through, and just have them understand like the struggles that Black people face?
Sure. So I would start by saying, you might sometimes you get further by asking questions rather than offering answers or challenging people directly. So it really depends on the circumstance. But for instance, what comes to me is like, what would make you say that? When you say all lives matter, what exactly are you saying? And then allowing, I'm not saying you, but like,
okay.
Yeah, not you. So if I was speaking with somebody and they said, oh yeah, no, Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter. It's okay, yeah, that's interesting. But what do you mean when you say that? And try to engage in a conversation. But ultimately, I would hope to get to the point where through that conversation, we'd say that, yeah, for what you're saying to be true, Black lives would have to matter. And so it's an emphasis is not an exclusion. so an emphasis on Black lives doesn't mean the exclusion of others. And so the claim or that statement doesn't, it actually ends up being unnecessary, and in many instances simply not helpful, because surely if all lives matter, then we wouldn't be seeing the socio-systemic disparities that we see. We wouldn't see the rates of poverty, child welfare apprehension, incarceration, over policing, police use of lethal force, you name it, that Black communities are experiencing. And so I hear you intellectually, but for even what you're saying to make sense, so again, playing out the scenario, Black lives would have to matter. And so if we look at the data in almost every statistical marker, Black lives don't yet matter. And so if you're really committed to your claim, all lives matter, come join the movement. That's what I would say.
That was you.
You get further by asking questions. I like to argue a lot, but I'm learning that arguing isn't always the best way of like getting to a common understanding with another person. So I really like that answer of asking questions. But I just wanted to, I guess, shift from like, this conversation is an important one to have, but I do want to talk about what we're doing that is what you're doing that's actually having positive effects, and what is working with our fight against inequality and injustice in Canada. So can you maybe bring forward some anecdotes of your work or things that you've noticed that are happening in Canada? Like in California, I read that San Francisco has defunded the police like many millions of dollars and reallocated it towards other services. So this to me is an example that the movement is working to some degree. So can you point out some of the work that has been done in Canada, or maybe that you've done, that you could say, wow, this is working, we need to keep moving forward?
Sure. Well, I can't claim responsibility as work I've done, but speak specifically on the movement to fund it and those calls for change. So for years, I've been speaking to the ways in which we need to divest from our reliance on policing and invest more in community. So it's been really interesting to see, after years of writing and speaking about it, it become mainstream, because there are many spaces in which I would articulate it and it wouldn't land well. But one thing that is interesting in this movement, where those calls have gained mainstream traction, is for instance, the Toronto Police Service Board has committed to undertaking a process of actively reviewing its budget towards creating a process for defunding and reallocating resources. And so my office has been tasked as the co-chairs of a body that's to oversee that process of identifying where what resources are surplus, and also specifically redirecting them towards social support, especially in the context of mental wellness within communities, because we know that a lot of the over-reliance on police happens in the context of under the auspices of mental well-being. And so that's one, I think, very concrete initiative. The City of Toronto itself, so I talked about the Toronto Police Services Board, the City of Toronto itself has undertaken a process to also look at increasing budgetary transparency, changing the rules around the degree to which the city's Auditor General can get access to information on police service budgets, so that there can be increased transparency. And so I think that's something that is still in development. Again, I can't claim credit for that. That's the organizing and advocacy in Black Lives Matter and supporters on the street calling for change. And then again, our office being strategically placed, being able to take advantage of that. But even beyond that context, for instance, there's this space called, we refer to it, many Black communities within Toronto refer to it as Little Jamaica. It's this historical strip within Midtown Toronto that Black people have been going to and creating community in for several decades. But it gentrification and redevelopment is pushing a lot of the Black businesses and Black people and Black institutions out of that space. But our office has been able to leverage some of the organizing and resistance that's been happening to actually bringing us to a space where now that area is going to get an official designation to protect that cultural heritage, life, vibrancy, and the businesses in that space to the extent that we can to offset some of the gentrification that's happening there. And so I would certainly point to that as an important thing that helps create change. There's also the more direct ways that come around conversations of funding. My team, because of how we're uniquely situated within the city, many folks have asked, okay, give me 1 second. I'm going to make sure my daughter.
It's adorable.
I know we're live, but we can't have a baby choking.
She okay? Take your time.
Thank you for indulging me on that. I know we're live, but yeah, for the folks who don't know, I've got a daughter. She's 3 years old, and she's being very patient with her daddy right now.
I don't know if were you finished your point?
Yeah, I was just talking about the different ways in which we're leveraging change. But actually, the last point I was going to make is from the inception of our team being at the city, we've been able to roll out some $17 million to Black community organizations. It won't change the world, but being in a space where we can work with our city partners to say, we've been doling out all these resources to the same organizations year over year. Here's how we can create a structure where more Black organizations and even grassroots organizations can get some of that resourcing. And so that's something that we're very proud of.
You mentioned that some of the work that you're a part of is redirecting money towards like other resources. And I wanted to talk about, can you speak on the value of having like the BIPOC community sit on these conversations about where money should be reallocated and maybe like what's the history behind these decisions, like and how that has impacted our communities?
Sure. Well, overwhelmingly, it's not a secret that the vast majority of decisions about the allocation of economic resources and economic resources has not been done in a way that is included or been directed by racialized people, by Black people, by Indigenous folks, by folks who experience the most significant degrees of social neglect. And so when you bring those folks to the table with their lived experiences, they have power to influence the direction of resources. And so it's a way of moving more towards the direction of self-determination and democratizing processes so that folks can have more control over their lives and well-being. You can argue that a part of why the conditions of social disadvantage persist is because you have the same people not from those communities continuing to make decisions for and about those communities. And so by bringing or creating spaces where racialized people, Black folks, Indigenous folks are deciding for themselves how to support their needs, I think you move more quickly towards finding the answers, towards change. You get better solutions, you get better ideas, and you start to break some of the inertia that just comes when you just say, well, this is just how we do it. This is just the policy. The point is it's not working, and it hasn't worked when it comes to racialized folks. And so we often, part of the action plan itself calls for Black folks to be involved in, and we create supports for Black folks to be more involved in city decision-making for that very reason.
All right, so kind of touching upon what Malcolm was saying with your work on mobilization, I just wanted to know, as an advocate right now in the work that you're doing, how are you mobilized during this pandemic with COVID-19 taking place in terms of like the work that you're doing for anti-Black racism, do you have any suggestions for students who are trying to, advocate for important issues like these, but, we're under certain constraints at the moment when it comes to going outside and whatnot. So I wanted to know from your perspective, how are you taking that on with the work that you're doing right now?
Sure. So I see my work is not necessarily doing the mobilizing, but it's more of amplifying the voices of the folks who are doing that work, and also translating those calls for change and leveraging that in systems. So bringing it to policymakers, showing them what's happening so that they can actually make better decisions to support the well-being of Black folks. But for folks who are not similarly situated, what I would say is, first things first is there's certainly your interest and your feeling of connection to the movement. We're talking about Black lives, which I think is really important. But it's also important that you take a moment and think about, well, what do I have to offer and what am I willing to offer? And so you could offer anything from writing support. You might be a good communicator. You might have actual resources, so everything from donations to access to a vehicle to your relationships and connections. You might know somebody who has access to resources, and you might be able to leverage that. But when it comes to these movements, it's important to know that just plugging in wherever is not always the best. Listen to and hear from the people who are doing that work. Spend some time listening to what's being said, and you can present yourself and say, hey, I'd like to support. And then the next question is, how can I support? But also part of you supporting or offering that answer is to say, well, here's what I have access to, or here's what I can do, here's what I think I can do. Is this useful? And the folks who are engaged in that struggle, and the folks who are being served by that organizing, more often than not, they'll help respond back, and they'll say, well, this is useful, this is not, this is what we were hoping for, the other pieces are not so useful. So at the end of the day, I think it's about right relationship. It can't be like a vacation into advocacy. Right? Like, I'm going to show up, this is interesting, I read the pamphlet, I'm going to jump in. Know that you're just going to jump out in a certain short time if you're really committed. I'm not saying it needs to be like a lifelong commitment, but I think there's a certain level of respect that is needed, and showing that respect means taking the time to understand what you can offer, and listen to the voices of folks who are doing that work, and then also listen to the voices of the people who are being served, and then trying to find ways to be supportive.
Yeah. Just to kind of follow up with what you're saying, in terms of getting involved, especially for students and how we all kind of got involved. A lot of students think that you need to be involved in student governance to really make an impact. And a lot of students are sometimes afraid to even just get involved due to the nature of some certain topics. And so, or at times students are just also lost about who do we contact first if we want to, bring our ideas and start invoking change. How would you suggest, would it be like talking to your city mayor or someone in your municipal writing, kind of to gauge how we can make those influences in the sense of let's say policy change when it pertains to these issues? And for some of us who are experiencing them, kind of where can we kind of dig in to see how we can help with these certain things?
It's a great question. So there's certainly multiple points of intersection. You don't have to be a part of student government. Mm-hmm. What I would say is because of the way systems of oppression operate, you're rarely going to be the first person to ever see a kind of injustice and say that it needs to change. So I think one of the first things that you should do is probably take a moment and think, who else might be doing this? Who else might be seeing this? And start doing some research and trying to plug in with those folks, because you can go directly to a city council, you can go directly to a mayor, you can go directly to a representative of provincial or federal government. But we're in these systems, we're stronger when we are with other folks. And so you might find more value in connecting with people who are already raising these points. You'll find often that it's already been articulated, and you just help to amplify it, or your voice adds to the level of volume or urgency of that matter. So I think doing research, finding out who's speaking to those issues, plugging in, or you can also just write directly, sign a petition or a form letter and get it to those representatives. and find a way to be involved. But again, I think where real change happens is where change happens through the creation of communities of organizing and resistance. And in these days, it's rare that you'll be the only person who sees a thing and is touched by it and really wants to engage in some sort of change work around it. So try to find those other people who are doing that work, even if it's one other person. Just connect with them, like you exchange ideas. Say, I've also noticed this. This is a problem, and ask, like, are you plugged into anybody who's doing this work? No, I'm not. I don't know of anybody. Maybe we can look together. And then you now have more resources already to help do this work. Or you just to decide, you know what, we are passionate. We have a unique skill. We do art. We're connected to a special community where there's different things that we can do. And you can leverage that.
Thank you.
I had one question. It pertains a lot to my personal life when I have these discussions with people, and I would love your input on this because I think it'll definitely help me. So often when I talk to people about the criminal justice system, I often say that we both can agree quite often that there is racism present in the criminal justice system. But then when it comes to the discussion of defunding the police, it's always something that's very controversial that I can't seem to find a middle ground with people. So I was kind of hoping that you can give more of your input on having these discussions with people and even maybe explaining more on what defunding the police is. It will definitely help with Concordia students and myself.
So one thing it's important to say is there's a range of perspectives on what defunding the police looks like and what it actually means. What I can offer, though, is some points that tend to be common throughout. Again, the idea is that, so there's people who are outright abolitionists and see defunding as a way towards abolition. And then there's some who are more, they'll just say, well, defund you can keep the police, but we just need to have them with less resources. So there's a range of perspectives on that. And I think just acknowledging that and understanding those differences can help move away from some of the confusion that's there. But by and large, ultimately, it's just a question of taking a moment and realizing that all the data shows that where housing, jobs, businesses, school, healthcare are stable, accessible, responding to the well-being of communities, you actually don't have instances, you don't have the same levels of crime. It actually diminishes quite significant. Crime, violence, social neglect, those things tend to evaporate. So the things that we tend to think we need police for, the conditions for that go away. They don't totally disappear, I should say. There's still instances of harm that happen, but it doesn't necessitate police for it. And so you're actually creating better conditions for well-being that keep everyone more safe, actually. So if you're really concerned about public safety, the best public safety measure is socioeconomic well-being. And culturally responsive socioeconomic well-being. So what that means is it will look different for different racialized communities. So healthcare services should and would look different in terms of responding to the particular needs of Black communities, to Indigenous communities, to South Asian communities, to queer and trans folks who are from those communities, and so on and so forth. But we can't get there if all our resources are tied up, and resources are finite. Public resources, that you have a set budget. Sure, governments can print money. They usually only do so in really extreme circumstances. So it's helpful to say the money is finite. We know that housing is in shambles. We know that transit is too expensive. We know that it's food is too expensive for far too many people. So why not take these resources and help infuse those things? And so people will be less likely to be involved in conditions of violence and crime, and therefore diminish the very reason that many folks often feel compelled to call police. It's not an easy sell. I'm not saying this in a way that would suggest that will just have the blinders fall off of folks' eyes, but really and truly, we have to understand that the safest communities are the ones that have strong economic indicators. And if we only have finite resources, and if you look at your actual city budgets and recognize that there's this dramatic disparity, we have to make different political decisions if we really want to keep people safe.
Thank you.
Okay.
I know you mentioned there's a lot of different ways of getting involved, and I think that's really important to understand and to acknowledge. Like there isn't just one, it's not just do policy work, or it's not just do being a lawyer, or going into academics, but we are kind of talking about for the subject of like defunding the SPVM in Montreal. There is a lot of people behind this movement, and I was wondering, like, what would you recommend? What are some ideas of like making this happen from a lawyer's perspective, from your perspective?
That's a great question. So the Quebec Charter actually has social rights embedded in it in a way that's, I would argue, far more progressive than many other provinces. And so leveraging the social rights. And when I say social rights, I mean rights around poverty. It's not robust, but it's there in a way that's not there in other jurisdictions. And so I think there's a strong point of leverage to say that we are actually advancing human rights, and these institutions seem to be inhibiting our ability to fulfill the quasi-constitutional promise of this province. And there is no constitutional protection to be a police officer, to have a police service, but there is a constitutional or quasi-constitutional protection as it relates to social and economic rights that the province has. And so from a lawyer's perspective, for me, that's a juicy space to leverage and say, like, how do you exploit that? How do you continue to remind government leaders and policymakers that the actual Quebec charter speaks to this? And so while you might have your hesitation and worries about this, there's no the act that governs policing is not quasi-constitutional, and so we have to make decisions, and we have to have one set of laws and principles that are more sacrosanct than the others, and the Quebec Charter actually trumps the others. And beyond that, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms does as well. And so we're operating from that space of leveraging those human rights as articulated. And I think continuing to harp on that and being creative and engaging with lawyers and legal institutions and legal advocacy organizations to make that point, I think would be effective. And so that's, if I was putting on my lawyer's hat, that's where I would go.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Is there something that non-lawyers can do to help you in this battle? Like, what can we do for that?
I think it's I'm of the school of thought that lawyers are effective and they can be helpful, but I think it's just the people. The people are where the real strength is, and so I think continuing to build the relationship between folks who are lawyers and who are policymakers that have proximity to politicians and decision makers. And I think where those relationships are strong, they're authentic, they're respectful, and they're meaningful, then you create the best opportunities for change. So how can you help? Just reaching out. If you find, I know there are a lot of lawyers, having gone to school in Quebec, I know that there are a lot of lawyers out there and legal organizations that would welcome just more support, whether it be volunteers or just knowing the perspectives that they're taking and then reiterating them. And so it's not just lawyers who are saying, for instance, well, the Quebec Charter privileges these social rights, and so we need to move forward in that. So if more people are saying that, it can get more traction and actually bring more change.
We're nearing the end of our discussion here. I just wanted to ask my last question here. What's a piece of work that you've done or that you're working on right now that you're really excited about or really proud of, or yeah?
That's a fun question. So there's a lot of things I'm really proud of, but I would say probably the biggest thing would probably be since around 2014, I've been really trying to advocate for increased knowledge, awareness, and commitment to the International Decade for People of African Descent. And I don't want to be heard as saying I'm solely responsible, but by and large, governments have started to take the International Decade seriously. And the federal government, for instance, has started to direct tens of millions of dollars to the International Decade for People of African Descent. And when there was times when I was initially doing deputations before government leaders, and they're like, "What is this thing?" And the International Decade, I should say, it's not some obscure project or initiative. The United Nations is called for the member states across the world, and so now you're finding governments, organizations, institutions. The province of Nova Scotia has a whole plan around implementing a framework of action around the International Decade. As I mentioned, the federal government has committed tens of millions of dollars, if not more, around making the International Decade real. The province of Ontario officially declared the International Decade. And so for me, because it's a strong framework for change, and it goes across the world and connects Black populations to the global African populations, to me, it's an exciting thing that I feel proud to have contributed to, at very least, raising awareness around it in Canada.
That's amazing. Thanks.
Hi, I'm kind of going to come in and ask for one last closing question here. Mainly on, I guess, how we as a Black community can come together. I know we come, we all come from different backgrounds, whether it's Caribbean, African, but sometimes it seems like we are in a tug of war sometimes with what things are necessary and what things are not, just because of different contextual things that may have happened in history, and et cetera. So from this movement with the Black Lives Matter, I know it's united a lot of us for what's going on with the discrimination that we face, but how would you recommend with us from now on, I guess, being able to come together and be able to fight for, these things that we all need as a community, essentially?
Yeah, I would say anti-Black racism doesn't care if you're Black from Africa or if you're Black from Latin America, if you're Black from the Caribbean. Anti-Black racism is just anti-Black. And so I think we have to be aware of that and say, okay, yes, of course we have differences, and we're being lumped in this category, but the way these systems of oppression operate is they don't make these distinctions, or where those distinctions are made is just to reinforce anti-Black racism. And so how can we become very, very focused and unrelentingly focused on the ways in which anti-Black racism plays out in society? So over incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, so suspension, expulsion within schools, or streaming, or housing precarity, police use of lethal force. Officers are not asking, is this a Black person from the Caribbean or Africa? They're just shooting, and then they'll figure it out afterwards. And that obviously is horrific kinds of violence. And so there's a level at which we have to take our differences and be like, yeah, of course we don't come from the same spaces. In the same way, we know that there are hundreds of different indigenous communities, but there had to be a coming together to say, we're going to do the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, respecting and understanding all those differences, but we're going to come to these 94 calls to action. And yeah, and absolutely not everyone's going to agree, but there has to be a common understanding that, at reconciliation, this is the biggest tent we can get under, and there's some people who will stand outside of parts of it, but by and large, we have to create some sort of collective agenda for change, because again, these systems of colonial white supremacy don't care about these distinctions. That's actually why we're here as indigenous communities. And so what I'm saying is, as Black folks, we need to learn from that struggle. Although the issues aren't resolved, there's a tremendous learning that we can do to say, okay, yeah, we have these differences, but if all those different nations could come together and decide that they're going to collectively move in this space, we have to find ways to do so as well. It's a different history. I don't want to make a false equivalence, but I think there's room in principle to learn from that. And again, it goes to that overlapping consensus. We might not agree on everything, but there's spaces where we can actually. I don't think there are any, regardless of your background, I don't think there's anybody who feels that Black people aren't should be over policed or overexposed to violence, or our schools should be so bereft of Black teachers or Black curriculum, or that housing should be as expensive or food should be as expensive, and so on. And so if we be very focused on those pieces and resolve those other tensions in other ways, I think we'll create the best opportunity for change for all of us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that.
Before we wrap this up, we had one last question from the comment section. People are asking, who the poster is in the background. So if you could,
it's Roberta Flack, actually. Roberta Flack. So folks may be familiar with Lauryn Hill's song "Killing Me Softly."
Yeah.
The original is Roberta Flack, who's behind me. So from the '70s, and so that iconic look from the '70s. She's not the sole one. So people often see it as Angela Davis, and it's sort of reminiscent of Angela Davis. But yeah, it's Roberta Flack.
Amazing.
Wrong. No, yeah. Thank you, Anthony, for honestly taking the time to really be able to speak with us tonight. And it was really insightful having this discussion with you. I could say for all three of us and some of the people watching, we learned a lot. I was even taking some names down of the people that you mentioned as well, and also it was insightful, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, you were dropping a lot of knowledge on us, and I have some research to do after my finals are done.
No, thank you so much. It was a fun conversation. I'm glad we could do it.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for coming to the CSU virtually.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of love for the CSU and Concordia more generally. I didn't say this, but during my time when I was at McGill Law, I was certainly intellectually and I think academically, I was certainly a McGill student. But socially, admittedly, I was a Concordia student. I was always at Concordia because of the sense of community and the vibe, the energy. No disrespect to the folks at McGill, but it was just more in line with what I was looking for. And so I have tremendous love, support, respect for Concordia and the Students Union and also like the folks in the African Caribbean student network. So Action was a group that really helped bring me and connect me to communities in Montreal at the time. And so it's a big way of me saying thank you and also kind of giving back for the groundedness that Concordia gave me moving forward in my career. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Take care.